And Professor Keller doesn't need any introduction. He is a E.V. Osborn Professor of Marketing in Senior Associate Dean for Marketing and Communication at Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. And he has degree from Cornell, and Carnegie-Mellon universities. He has been at the faculty positions at Berkeley, Stanford, and UNC, and an award-winning research with over 120 published papers and 2 marketing leading textbooks. And believe me, sir, all in the call are using your textbooks, that is why the students and all the members are here to see the author that they have appreciated and loved so far. Through the years, he has served as a brand confidant to marketeers for some of the world's most successful global brands, including Accenture, American Express, Disney, Ford, Intel, Levi-Strauss, Nike, Procter & Gamble, Samsung, and Starbucks. I don't want to be between you and the audience. Over to you, Professor Kevin, for the art and science of branding. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate that and the opportunity to speak today. And the team that was, I love the 7 factors, and I'm just gonna, just so to make sure everyone knows them again, I'm gonna just list them again because I really like them. They very much align with the way I think and some of the things I'm gonna talk about. So couldn't ask for a better introduction, so thanks. Purpose, sincerity, empathy, trust, agility, maybe digital agility, partnerships, sustainability, all adding up to sort of humanity and sort of thinking as a brand manager or brand steward of how a more humanistic approach. So I love the introduction.
Thank you.
It was great, totally spot on. And it's a pleasure to be in Mumbai, or Bombay as I still sometimes call it, in part because of my wife. So even though I'm only there virtually, I have been there in person many times. And I got married there, in fact, just almost 30 years ago. So it's been a while, and had the great pleasure of doing that and coming back many times and doing several workshops with Professor Jacob, as we were talking about earlier, with strategic brand management, and wonderful co-authors. Couldn't ask for a better set of co-authors for strategic brand management, bringing that book over to India, as well as having marketing management adapted. So very, very pleased to be here. It's always nice to be there. And I always get my dose of cricket, because in the US, you don't get a whole lot of cricket. I'm sorry, we just don't. We have lots of other sports. So cricket is not high on the list. But whenever I go to India, I always learn again how important the sport is, and also what a great sport it is. So all that just as background. Let's start. In this talk, it was interesting. I've over the last year, no surprise, I've given a lot of talks about the pandemic and branding and how to think about it. And I really didn't want to do it for this audience. I felt like, one, you've been hearing a lot about it in different ways. 2, I really wanted to do something a little different than I haven't done as much before, although I'm going to pull a lot of ideas that I've shared in the past, but I'm going to pull them together and apply them in a different sort of way, if you will. So let me share my screen and I'll set this up for you. So this is a talk that I call the art and science of branding. And the notion here is I really wanted to speak to how to think about and how to manage brands. And I wanted to do it in a way that reflected how I approach it and how I think that you can think about approaching brand management. And I think you probably do this implicitly, but I want you to think maybe a little more explicitly about it. And so let me set this up. There's a few slides at the beginning, and then you'll see we're going to go in detail on things. So the premise is pretty straightforward, and that is good branding is an art and a science. So it is certainly, there's a scientific aspect, but there's also an art, if you will, to brand management. So what exactly does that mean? We've heard that before. Lots of people say this. It's not that phrase is used for marketing, used for branding. What do we mean by that? Well, it means that you have to do 2 things. to me, you have to be analytical, systematic, and apply really key branding tools and concepts. That there is a rigor, there's a science to this. In the world of big data and analytics and all this, we're having a chance to inform ourselves in different ways, but it's the tools that you use that are so critical in the concepts. So 1. 2 is being creative and inspired as part of that. Left brain side of the brain, right side of the brain, if you will, using both sides. And there's lots of ways to think about creativity, and lots of people talk about it and being inspired, but I want to bring it down maybe to a slightly different way than is often talked about. And I want to talk about a little bit more about a philosophy that guides you, that sort of impacts and fuses the way that you use those tools. And that to me is a lot of what creativity is. Creativity is finding solutions in different ways that are imaginative, that are ones that are maybe a little out of the ordinary, but it comes back to the tool. I still feel the tools provide that substance, they provide the structure. The question is, how do you apply those tools? So one of the challenges that I have faced for years in teaching marketing or branding is always, I can teach the concepts, but how do I teach students how to use the concepts as effectively as possible? What ways can I do that? How do I go about doing that? So that's the one challenge. And so I think, to me, it is partly being, be creative and inspired in using them in terms of developing a philosophy, how you think in point of view, how you think about the world. And we actually, so to start, we have 7 tenets. That was our introduction, a terrific introduction that has 7 tenets. And those 7 tenets provide a substance and a foundation, if you will, for how that might, that application. So those are all beliefs. So that's what we're going to talk about. So one question, are we getting the green, are you getting the green graffiti on your screen? Is that, are other people getting that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there,
yes.
Yeah, is there a way to get, that's not me.
Yeah, I think the admin could just click and clear it. It's happening because someone else is annotating on the screen.
Yeah, is there a way to get rid of it, or now that it's on, or is it?
No, there's a way to get rid of it. The admin is someone who, if you're projecting it, you might get an option on the top. If you click on annotate and annotate, and then you get clear screen or something like that. So you can.
Okay, so the top of my screen, yeah. So I see. Is it annotate? And and what do I do? I click that, and then what do I do? Just erase?
Just click clear the screen.
Clear screen.
Oh, clear the screen.
Yeah.
I've done
Oh, I
it.
see. Yeah. Oh, you've done it. Okay, thanks. Yeah, got it.
But somebody's still doing it. I don't know.
Please disable it.
Yeah.
Disable.
There might be an option to disable somewhere.
Yeah, I'll check out and take care.
Yeah, disable the annotation.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to make sure it was that you could see. Okay, that's all. So, all right, great. So that's the set. So that's the premise. The premise is that branding is an art and science, but what do you mean by that? And how do you go about doing that? And you go about doing that by being analytical and systematic with a set of tools and concepts, and then being creative and inspired, being guided by philosophy. The philosophy is what you, in point of view, you apply to how you use the tools. And that's really critical. So what I want to talk about is mostly the philosophy, but I do want to mention a little bit on the tools. So let's get back to that. So there are all kinds of ways of thinking about the more structural part of branding. This is, in the textbook, I have these 8 keys, or we have these 8 keys of branding excellence, and starting more strategically with the mission, vision, and purpose, and positioning and architecture, and then moving through, how to integrate and build loyalty and value propositions, and then innovation and relevance and growth. So that's one little checklist, if you will, and there's a more formal report card that I published years ago in Harvard Business Review that's also in the book. It's just an example of kind of the sorts of topics, but you need the actual tools. And that's really what the tools are, that you in concepts are the ones that take that and bring it to life in different ways. So the report card is just sort of a big picture sort of thing. So some of those tools, I'm just going to list them briefly and not going to go in a lot of detail on those. And these are ones I like. These are ones that are in the textbook that we have, and again, the Indian adaptation, as well as in the U.S. and other countries where it's being used. So I go into a lot of detail on these things. But mission, vision, purpose, brand strategy, brand promise, positioning, value proposition, all those kinds of things. The positioning model, this is a critical one. I will talk a little bit about this. It's going to come up about having mental maps and points of parity, points of difference, creating some core brand values and a mantra. It's kind of a summary. And a brand resonance model. So, which is a model that can, is a way of thinking about how to build loyalty and engagement, kind of puts all this together, or a brand, and ultimately a brand value chain model. Those three models are all what I call my Russian doll models. I've talked about them in Mumbai in the past in talks. So there are those kinds of, and these are the tools I like to use a little bit on the strategy part and guiding me. And then there's some brand architecture development, which is really important, 3-step process that I developed in the past, which has a checklist for brand extensions, a scorecard. Again, there's a very set of guidelines and tools, if you will, and concepts. Something I've been using a lot lately are customer pyramids. There's a lot of cool things you can do with those. You can think of them as brand engagement pyramids, but there are also other ways of thinking about just how your market can be segmented in different ways and how you market differently to different people. Then there's choice criteria for the brand elements when you're thinking of branding a new product. Again, there's a nice checklist and criteria, brand leveraging model, 3-step model again, and the brand equity measurement system, a series of different steps that you can take, if you will, different pieces that you can include. So there's a whole lot of these tools. These are just the ones that I like to use, and they cover a lot. They're very comprehensive. They cover a lot of ground strategically, tactically, but there are others out there. So I'm just illustrating that with these, and we're not going to go in detail. They're in the textbook. They're in other places that I've written about, and there are other, like as I said, other tools you can use. So let's set that aside. So the point is, we all have lots of different tools. Companies have their own set of tools. Agencies. So there's a lot of frameworks and tools and concepts. How do you apply them? How do you make sure that as you're thinking about building the brand for today, tomorrow, and in the future, that you're doing the right things? And that's being guided by philosophy. So my philosophy has really come largely as a result of working with a lot of companies. So it's informed by academic research, but also a chance, again, I've shared this slide in the past, these are companies I've worked with for years, and some of them for years and years and years, in different projects, different capacities. And you can see they're grouped a little bit by industry, and the bottom left is the CPG, and then the bottom right, you get some of the more the kind of durable goods, if you will, financial services above that, some tech, then up to healthcare and pharma, and in the middle we have some media, in top left we have like transportation. So there's a whole lot of different industries I've worked with, and I've been really, really fortunate that way, because I've had a chance to take those tools I just shared with you and concepts, apply them, and learn. I've learned a lot in doing projects with companies, and that has informed my philosophy. And some of my philosophy just comes around just how I think about marketing, and probably from the very first class I took, and just learned about how to customer centricity and marketing myopia and all those kind of core concepts. And then you start doing, learning from academic research, you start learning from this industry experience, and you shape and come up with a philosophy. So what I thought I would do is and again, because I know it's Friday, I appreciate everybody showing up on a Friday late in Mumbai. And I know, and again, hope all is safe there. You're on our minds and have been with all that's going on over there. but I appreciate everyone. So I thought I would do something that I'm hoping you'll find both interesting and a little fun. And I was going to walk through kind of a history of 8 core companies that I took really valuable lessons from that inform my philosophy. And to me, and I share these because I think these are lessons that may inform your philosophy too, or reinforce the philosophy you already have. And I know many of you are experienced and already have a lot of this, but it's just a way to, I want you to think a little bit about sort of what is those tenets that you have about brand building in terms of how to think about different things. So let's walk through these, and I'm going to share you a lot of lessons that I think are helpful, and then we'll move into a little bit of a wrap up, and then we'll have plenty, I hope, plenty of time for questions and answers. So, I'm sure we will. So let's start with Disney, which was actually literally probably the very first consulting project I did. This is going way back. I've worked with them through the years, but the first project was late 80s, I believe. And I learned a number of things about branding from one of the world's, most successful brands. I mean, Disney is an amazing brand, and Disney has amazing brands and all its characters and film themes, etc. So one of the things I learned early on was the importance for top-down brand management, and that no brand was too strong, and you had to avoid death by 1,000 cuts. And how I learned that was Disney was in the process when I was working with them, they were just starting to get aggressive with their consumer product licensing, which clearly they've developed almost to an art form, but how they were taking their characters and brands and, in different, moving them into different product categories on the basis of licensing arrangements with different companies. Well, one of the things they found was that everybody wanted to use Disney, including some products and companies where it didn't make any sense. So they really learned the value of making sure that they're top down. There was an Office of Brand Management, which I helped them establish, to provide to inform and enforce guidelines about what the brand stood for, and importantly, to create some guardrails. So that was the other lesson I kind of got as part of this. And then the power of a brand mantra, which I have now kept and used across many companies ever since then, is a marketing filter. So the notion of fun family entertainment, or probably if I did it again, or I would recommend maybe magical fun family entertainment, but even just that mantra as a filter was just really, really helpful in terms of being able to provide that guidance for where the brands should and shouldn't go if they're associated with Disney in some way. So to me, that was a really important lesson about again, and the notion of death by 1,000 cuts is such a key concept, because it's the fact that not any one decision itself isn't so bad. It's how they add up, and that means you got to be careful with those little decisions. So again, informing my philosophy about how careful you have to be, no matter how strong your brand is, to not compromise in ways that, even though they may seem little, it's a slippery slope, and before you know it, you've got problems in some ways. The other thing I learned from Disney was they had this unbelievable format and kind of in channel brand platform. There were lots of ways they could get their products out to market once they embraced some of this licensing. So whether it was obviously the movies and the videos and the DVDs, and now it's Disney Plus and streaming, and so it's a whole range of different activities, and how they could benefit from the synergy of films helping them sell, toys and games and other kinds of things, which then help them reinforce their films. So it was just neat to see that leverage and that synergy. That said, I also learned how, and it's not really listed here, it's sort of a sub-corollary, how you have to be careful not to be overly formulaic. So at one point, Disney, I worked with them in the early 90s when they launched Lion King, huge success. And it was one that they took to a lot of different categories, and they had Happy Meals at McDonald's and all these things. But then as they went through the sequential, year after year, different films, many of them Little Mermaid or whatever were big hits, but some of them didn't necessarily connect in the same way. And I remember there was one of the films was Hunchback from Notre Dame, and so the Hunchback, and well done and everything, but it just didn't have that connection. And they tried to blast it out in the same way they kind of blasted out everything else, which worked well before because there was so much excitement and appreciation for those previous movies. This didn't have the same kind of reaction. So it didn't work as well. And it was more problematic. It was more forced. And they learned to be a little more kind of artful about how they went to market and a little more careful about it. So they weren't just always dialing everything way up, taking into account some of the film and how it worked. So, but anyway, so those are some of the lessons I learned from Disney, and just having a very strong brand, but how to manage it sort of properly. So let's switch over second example, and that's my Nike experiences. And I started with Nike around the same time. So again, late 80s and up until recent time, literally a couple years ago. So different projects, different kinds of activities. There's a lot of lessons with Nike. This is a very successful brand that started in, if you go back not long before I was working with them, even kind of in the 60s and the 70s. At that time, was selling running shoes, basketball shoes, tennis shoes to mostly, males aged kind of 12 to 29, mostly in the US, okay? Fast forward to today, 2021, they're selling all kinds of shoes, clothing, and equipment in all kinds of sports to all kinds of people, ages, demographics, et cetera, in all kinds of countries all over the world. So, I mean, it's phenomenal growth trajectory. So clearly did a lot of things right. Here's some of the lessons that I took away through those decades working with them. One was the importance of staying close to customers and learning from mistakes. Now, they make mistakes, and I can tell stories about how they struggled when they first went to Europe, or when they first were starting to market more directly to women, both of which had problems. But the key was how they came back from that and how they learned from that, because they did stay close. They did always try to understand how athletics and sport, what it meant to people, and then how their products kind of fit in. So it just is a really valuable lesson. And it's one of those, everyone says in marketing, we stay close to our customers, but there are huge differences in what people actually do and how close they truly are. So to me, that was really important lesson. This is one that has stayed with me, is the importance of blending functional and emotional positioning. Just how critical that was. And this was a brand that had really kind of centered itself on more functional, rational marketing when it launched. It always felt like that's what athletes wanted. That's all they cared about. Tell me about how it's going to help me run faster, jump higher, what have you. Tell me the technology. Tell me what's new. And one of the things they learned early on is that there's this emotional side to sport, which we all kind of know, but it's one of those you have to kind of understand from a customer standpoint what that means and what they're looking for. And they took that and recognized the importance of aspirations, of self-empowerment, of people helping people achieve their goals, whatever they may be. And they may be fairly modest, it may just be to be a little healthier, maybe lose a little weight. Post-pandemic, I think that's going to be many people's goals, and certainly one of mine. The weight gain during the pandemic has been, for a lot of people, has been an issue, and certainly for me. So that blend of functional and emotional is that 1-2 punch, and how they work together. And that's the key. You got to be careful when you layer on emotional or try to connect it. It's got to be authentic. It has to really truly fit together to get the power of that synergy, the power of the 1-2 punch. So I learned that from them, and how they took those core principles of technological performance, and aspirational self-empowerment.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And then, the other thing I got was the importance of innovation and relevance, and how critical that is to always be moving forward, but moving forward in the right direction. This is a brand that is relentlessly innovative, and you have to. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have core values. It doesn't mean you're focused and you're consistent in certain ways, but you have to be always adapting and moving forward. And to Nike's credit, they have really embraced technology. They have really actively experimented with different kinds of products and different ways of marketing, all towards, you know, serving the athlete. And again, if you go to their mission statement says, if you have a body, you're an athlete. And there's, you know, it's a powerful statement. And it's saying that, the mission statement, it technically is to serve, and inspire and innovate for athletes. With an asterisk, you have a body, you're an athlete. So it's a powerful statement because they really are recognizing that there's a range of goals and a range of athletes that they need to kind of satisfy. So this innovation and relevance, because innovation is all about finding new solutions. Relevance is making sure that you are reflecting what people care about, what they think about. At the end of the day, end of the week, end of the month, end of the year, what have you done to innovate and stay relevant and to make sure that you're constantly moving forward. You cannot stand still. And I've just taken that away and talk about it all the time. And I just feel like they have been the masters of that in terms of, I call it anyone who knows basketball, I talk about fast break marketing, because fast breaks are when you're going back and forth really up and down the court, and that's the way they operate. And then another one is the value of a strong agency partner. So the partnership point that we brought in at the beginning was so important, and that the team talked about is so important. And you have lots of different partnerships in this network economy. It's more and more true of collaborations in different ways. One of the most important ones, certainly for a more mass market or a company or brand with a strong external face, is communications, and having an agency partner, whether it's an ad agency or a digital agency, PR, whatever it is, or all of the above combined into one. It just having that, and they've had Wieden and Kennedy from the start. Same agency in Portland, Oregon, where they're headquartered, who has just done wonderful work, and they've now have many other clients. But Nike has always has benefited from that relationship and the power of that relationship. So the Nike lessons continue. So apologies, but I have another slide on Nike. But I just want to talk. I wanted to make this point, though. It's a really important point. And that is the other thing I took away from Nike, having a chance to sort of look how they, go to market strategy, if you will, and how they built their brands in different parts of the world. And, they always have these really well-designed and implemented marketing activities and programs, and how important that is to make sure that you design and implement. So the strategy and the tactics really come together. And this is where that brand report card comes in a little bit. We talked about earlier, but in general, having a good brand and product portfolio, so you can make sure you've got the right products out there and branded the right way. And then there's the push-pull, which is so, fundamental to marketing. But these days, it's having, on the distribution side, the range of omni-channel, direct and indirect, that really work together to create that right shopping experience and everything. One, and two, that's the kind of the push, if you will, side. The pull side is that communications and what you do to really engage and motivate and get people's attention and build your brand and help them, as we talked earlier, when you talk about sincerity and trust. And a lot of those core values come across in how you communicate, in what you do, in your actions that you take. So all of those that are so critical. And they've always done it in a very creative and entertaining way. That's, I think, one of the things I marvel about them is their ability to do that, to tell their story, to sell their product, but do it in a way that people find enjoyable, interesting, and amusing, or whatever it might be. And then lastly, they kind of borrowing brand equity, which is sort of, when you think of the three ways you build a brand, it's how you brand it, how you market it, and then how you connect it, if you will, to other entities, people, places, and things. So the opportunities to kind of leverage that way. So that's, Nike. let's talk about Red Bull for a second. So those were the first two. Red Bull is an interesting brand. Red Bull is one I actually never formally consulted with. So unlike the others, all the others actually I'm going to talk about. But I got to know them pretty well because I was working with someone named Norbert Kreiheimer, a marketer who at the time was in charge of Solomon Skis. And we did a couple projects together, and I flew over there to Annecy, France, and had workshops. And then he then went over to Red Bull, and I was able to write a case study early on and learn a lot, just through the case study. And there, at the time, maybe less so now, but certainly then, a very private company, hard to get to know in a deep way and engage. But they were very forthcoming for the case, which is very helpful, which I've taught for years and kept up with them for years. So a couple things again back this, and just as you know, as we go through these, these are all things that inform part of my philosophy about how I think about when I'm looking at a brand. How do I advise a company, or what kinds of things do I think matter to them as I start working through the strategy and tactics and other recommendations I might make? This is always kind of in the back of my mind. It's the part of my philosophy. So one is this rewards for category pioneers. And this is as true now as ever. If you think of the digital era and the brands that are being born, and I'm sure in India and all over the world in the last, 2, 3, 5 years max, a lot of them are pioneers, and they're creating new categories. They're finding ways, they're building maybe off existing ones in different ways, but they're finding new ways to solve problems that involve different functionality, different product service offerings, what have you. So different rewards and there's a reward for being a category pioneer if you do it well, because you then have a chance to establish what that category norm is. And in today's world, if you're smart, you can really build a strong brand that provides a competitive advantage as others start to come in, and that's critical. And Red Bull created the functional energy drink category. It did not exist before they came along, was not there. So that was a new to the world category. There were soft drinks, there was, Gatorade, there all these had different functionality. No one was the functional energy drink. So they benefited from that, as you would in if you think of Uber or Airbnb and all the different examples that exist in India or Europe or around the world, from new brands that come up with new ways of satisfying people's needs to travel or people's needs to stay somewhere, what have you. So now as part of that, one of the things they did, one of the things I took away from them was how much value they got from having a really full range of brand elements. They had a great set of brand elements, the way they actually branded their product. The name itself, Red Bull, the logo, the slogan, it gives you wings, the packaging, that small can that really communicated potency. And so they didn't even have to run an ad before I even maybe had tried the product. I would have already formed maybe some opinion, in favorable opinion, on the basis of what I'm seeing. So to me, that is so important. Again, tying that in with being a pioneer, as you're starting to launch, take advantage of all the brand elements. So I'm always looking for that, with a slogan being the one hook is in particular. And Red Bull gives you wings was so important for them because they did not want to be seen as a mixer, which a lot of people were using it for at that time. It's for any application where you need a little lift. If you're a student, if you're a truck driver, whatever it might be, where you feel like you just need a boost. So, that functional energy fulfillment. And then the other thing they did that was so brilliant was they were very creative in their execution, but they were strategic. And so talk about art and science. They blended traditional sponsorship, traditional advertising. You've all seen the cartoon ads with Red Bull gives you wings. They run them around the world. They're very inexpensive, but they kind of provide a very nice foundation for what the brand does. But then they do the non-traditional, the Flugtag, Flying Day, and the crashed ice kind of, which is a little bit of roller derby on ice. And, they're creating these sports, and they have a whole media company around this, and a media kind of empire, if you will, that's taking this online and in the magazines and all these. So they've really done to me, a fascinating job of taking that brand promise and then building that out in different ways. All right. So moving along, because I want to get to Q&A really soon, but I've got to go through some more examples. So hopefully I'll get through this pretty fast. P&G, I learned a lot. I did a lot of work with them in the 2000s. And I worked with a really brilliant CMO named Jim Stengel, who was a great leader and a great team that he'd put together. And just, this was a very helpful time for me. And one of the things I learned was just the importance of having state-of-the-art brand management tools. I mean, they really felt that they needed to up their game to make sure they were building brands in the right way. They were measuring brands in the right way. So brand building frameworks, they had this equity scan brand tracking based in part on my brand resonance model. So really trying to come up with ways to take their thinking to the next level, and how important that is to have that state of the art. So again, back to philosophy, always thinking about making sure that everything's done in the most rigorous way, and upgrading, if necessary, what the tools and concepts are that the company may be using. A real appreciation for the emotional side of branding. It kind of goes back to what we talked about with Nike. And in this case, this is where I really saw the power of bringing together the functional and emotional in a very direct way. And this was Pampers, and I've told the Pampers story before when I've been over there, but it's such a great story because it was all about dryness, for years and years in product demo advertising, which they specialize in. And they took it over to an emotional side of dryness. It allows your baby to sleep better, to play more, or be happier, all of which helps the baby develop. And that's what you really care about as a parent. This is just a means to an end. That's the key, the dryness. So the way they blended and how they recognized for a company that had been kind of anchored on the functional product performance to bring in the emotions, I thought was really amazing. And then brand architecture. This is where I got a chance to start in recognizing how important that is. So again, when I'm always guided by making sure the architecture is in good shape. It is a critical piece of marketing and branding. And most brand architecture strategies need to be improved. So really, really thinking hard about that. And fewer, stronger brands, that was definitely one of the things I took away. And all the time now, I'm always thinking about how can there be greater focus on fewer, stronger brands. And then this whole kind of consumer and customer touch points, the first and second moments of truth in the store and at home when you try the product, and how important that is to pull that together. And again, they still do lots of the traditional and non-traditional ways in store, at home, ways to kind of make that happen. But again, thinking more broadly about products in particular, and thinking about at the store and what happens when you come home, in those customer, if you will, at the store, and then consumer at home. Value pricing, that was something else that I've always, my general thinking with pricing is you should make sure you're pricing according to the value you're creating. And the key is to create value. That's how you get a premium, if you create more value. So that was something they've always embraced. They're typically premium priced, but they understand that they have to have value that justifies that premium price. And then what is that? Either functionally or emotionally, that allows you to do that. And then something we talked about earlier was cause marketing and brand purpose came up in our intro, and which again, couldn't agree more how important that is. There are a lot of ways to think about purpose, but this was something that started P&G on a path, and Unilever, certainly one of their key competitors, has I think pushed this really, really powerful ways to be thinking about that purpose and how you build out, if you will, what your brand does in a bigger way for the world and for communities, and society and the environment, all those things that are so important. Okay, so let's do a few more and then we're going to open up to questions. So I want to talk about Samson briefly. Samson is, I think, one of the most fascinating brands in the last 20 years or so, because 20 years ago, they were a good brand, but they weren't a great brand. And now they're a great brand. I mean, they're very successful in many countries, in many categories. So what did I learn from them? How did that inform me? Well, my thinking, how is it part of my philosophy? To me, it reinforced the importance of having a compelling value proposition. Core marketing concept, but so important. And that is the sum of all the tangible and intangible costs and benefits. All that you give and all that you help people save versus what the cost is. And we're going to come out, as we come out of this pandemic, you know, we'll see what the economies of the world, how they respond. It's going to be very interesting. Regardless, there's always going to be cycles. There's always going to be times in particular where value becomes more important, but value is always important. That's a driver of consumer behavior for many consumers in many markets, in many categories. So understanding that and how important that is. And for them, the value proposition was very much predicated on design. So one of the things I loved about Samsung was how they elevated the importance of design, which others like Apple and there are other companies certainly been doing this in the car companies. But the functional and aesthetic, how a product works, looks, and feels. And Samsung put so much energy behind it, so much innovation, so much investment. So their products, you know, really, really looked better, worked better in terms of functionality, just had all that kind of benefit and value they were creating in the marketplace. And you're gonna benefit from that when that happens. And then the last thing was, as good as they were and as much as they were doing, back to these intangibles. And one of the things, again, we talked about in our introduction and the team talked about was it was the brand intangibles in terms of trust, authenticity, credibility, all those kinds of intangibles. And that was something they had to work on because they were not well known as a company. They so they really had to build that credibility notion. And again, back to my philosophy, I think credibility is one of the most useful concepts. I use it all the time. How good are what you do? How much do your customers trust you? And how just likable are you? How much do people like just interacting with you, learning about you? So having that sort of appeal. So to me, that's really, really important. And so I love this slide because it's just, I mean, if I asked you 20 years ago, who was going to be the leader in consumer electronics or, you know, or more recently, and, you know, in terms of smartphones or, you know, what you'd be thinking Sony, you know, you'd be thinking Apple, and Samsung has done a phenomenal job because they have a great value proposition, quality, design, and, you know, at a affordable price. You know, they tried to work that equation out. The price has probably gone up through the years, but still a great value proposition. Hyundai is doing the same thing with Toyota, very, very similar. All right, so I've got two more, I think, and then we'll be done. And these last two are a little bit more of the mistakes that you can make, and sort of to go through those really quickly. Actually, three, I think. Actually, there's three. And they're all kind of related. So I'm going to go through these pretty quick because I want to get to questions. I'm going to make sure we have at least half an hour. So, and the lessons are these are three great brands: Levi's, Coke, and one brand you may not know as well, and that's Miller Beer, which is big in the US, one of the top, really, two brands of beer. So they all kind of fell to the same trap. And the trap was a little bit of not innovating and staying relevant, or trying to be something they're not. Levi's problem was they didn't innovate and stay relevant. The opposite what I said Nike did, reinforced my philosophy. And they got in a huge trouble you have to go back in the 90s. They stuck with 501 jeans when fashions were changing. those became less fashionable. You know, advertising wasn't very impactful because, again, agency turnover, not building that partnership. And FCB, by the way, at one point was their ad agency, and they switched and used a bunch of different ones. And failing to design a really effective brand architecture, this was critical. Having the right brand and product portfolio, really critical. So, and competition came in different ways. Their channels and products weren't well aligned. They lost half their market share. This is an iconic brand and incredibly strong in the US and around the world. And they lost half their market share. So, you know, to me, that lesson was one I took away, how important it was to innovate and stay relevant. And that meant products, that meant channels, that meant communications. And I don't care how strong you were, going back to Disney, you better be moving forward. Coke was an example where they overreacted. And so I'm just going to highlight this, that when it's the importance of being faithful to your brand promise. Coke is always, you know, in terms of what makes it unique and special, it's one of the few brands that can be really positive and optimistic. And they made the mistake of running a campaign that was called Real, and it was trying to make the brand seem more contemporary and up to date, which is a key point of parity for them. But their point of difference was optimism, and there's no reason you can't be both. And so they ultimately ended up with Open Happiness as a campaign, and which kind of brought the two together. But in the process, they lost market share, and they just lost a lot of their marketing momentum. And to me, it was a real mistake. So that was something, this next slide kind of walks through this, describes the Real campaign and how it was trying to be down to earth. And it just didn't work, because that's not what, it's not the Coke promise. It's not what people really think about in terms of Coke. And it's not where Coke should be strategically. And this is where I'm going to skip this, but points of difference, points of parity, you know, just as, you know, again, point of parity being contemporary, point of difference being optimistic. You can do both. And that's what they ended up doing, starting with Coke Side of Life, and it became Open Happiness going forward. Last one, then we're going to wrap up and open up for questions. So this is on Miller, SAB Miller, South Africa Brewery. At one point bought them, now they've been bought again. A lot of consolidation in this industry. And this is being importance of being faithful against the brand promise. And the thing is, be really careful about the agency du jour, the hot agency. That's what got Levi's in trouble at times, okay? And Miller got in trouble too. So you hire the hot agency, and the hot agency did a great job with a certain client. Question is, how are they going to help you? Do they truly understand you? Are you going to build the right relationship going forward? And that's not what happened. Miller Lite had a wonderful position. This next slide kind of summarizes it. I'm going to kind of skip the details, but the basic message was they had a very clever duality, dual straddle positioning, really good. Best of both worlds in terms of taste and lower calories and lower carbs, which, is nice. You're overcoming the trade-offs. And then they went to, more of a lifestyle kind of communication that walked away from those core values. And their sales were going up after years of being stagnant. And then, of course, once they stepped away, they ran into trouble. Okay. So again, lesson there. All right. So all of this informs my branding philosophy. So I want to go through those stories to show you the lessons that you've learned as you go through and work with companies, as you read, either textbooks or read in the press or media, or just talk to people, go to workshops, go to lectures, seminars. It starts to inform how you think. And I'm going to kind of just skip over these last two slides without a lot of detail, because this is all the way, I'll just mention these. These are part of my tenets, if you will, of branding, just my core beliefs. The brand's a promise, sets expectations, reduces risk. I come back to that over and over again. What's the promise to consumers? What are they expecting from you? At the heart of a great brand is a great product or service experience. This is critical, because there are a lot of people in branding that I think do not put enough emphasis on the product. They're all so many products are commodities these days. I don't buy that. I feel that, one, you can differentiate yourself. Two, it's the core of everything you do. And you better really understand the value you're creating with that you can then build off of in other ways, emotionally and with intangibles, et cetera. Another key tenet to me, although philosophy, customers own your brands. Absolutely. You cannot lose sight of that. You have to know your customers because in effect they do. I mean, by their actions, they're going to decide whether you're going to be successful in the marketplace. That said, they don't necessarily want to manage your brands. And that's another thing I hear a lot. I think I hear too much that the customer's in charge, they're in control. That's some of the customers, some of the brands, some of the times, and in some ways. Don't overstate that, okay? You got to be really careful about that. So you got to properly engage customers. Some people do, and you want to engage them in the right ways. Others, you've got to understand how to market to them because they don't, that's not something they want. They have lives, they have families, they have jobs. They're not going to get engaged in your brand. There are too many brands in our lives. We have to pick and choose. All right, every brand contact matters. I firmly believe that. So that's why it's so important to manage the brand in a way that reflects what you do and what others are doing at the same time. So great brands are born out of opportunity. This is what makes branding so exciting, why you're always going to see new brands come out because there's going to be unmet needs and somebody's going to figure that out and relentlessly deliver on that. And that is exciting. And there's not a better way to build a brand. So always finding that opportunity, if you will, to build a strong brand. The best brand positioning is often finding those unique market solutions, overcoming trade-offs, best of both worlds, where you're combining things that don't typically go together. Great taste and fewer calories doesn't typically go together. Okay, so how do I make that done? Do that in a way that the marketplace appreciates, and that I can convince people and do that in a convincing way. So again, part of my philosophy is I'm always looking for, can I find that spot where I can tell a story about a brand that's so unique because of what it does that is overcoming trade-offs or bringing things together. Combining functional and emotional value drivers. Like we've talked about this, it's probably the third time I brought this up, but it's so important that those, I think, are linked and integrated, they're combined. All brands have boundaries. I don't care how strong your brand is. So understanding that, and you grow brands through little steps. Nike took a lot of little steps to go from where I described they were, years ago to where they are today. And then you balance brand deposits and withdrawals. They all kind of come together. The things that when you borrow equity to launch a new product in another category, you better make sure you invest. These the ones down here, I learned a lot, by the way, from Nivea. When I worked with Beiersdorf, this was in the 90s, I learned a lot about this sort of how you grow a brand, because they created a brand that was really around skin cream to skin care to personal care. And it was a fascinating case study that Unilever took with Dove, and P&G and others have learned from. So again, the list goes on. All right, so enough of my philosophy. Let me wrap up and let's go to Q&A, because I've seen some hands up, and sorry I haven't had a chance to call on anybody. I need to get through this material first, and now we're gonna have time to talk. So branding's not rocket science. And I've said this before. You've heard me, if you've come to any of my talks in the past. I'm not a rocket scientist, but my father was. He was in the Air Force here in the US and worked on rocket fuel. So he literally worked on rockets and the grand tour that would go to different planets and stuff. He's working on the rocket fuel for that. So, and I would tell him all about my book and my work in branding. And he found it fascinating. He eventually went into management after he retired from the Air Force. But he always reminded me that this was not rocket science. So and he did it in a very kind, generous way, because he appreciated what I did. But he was right, because it's an art and science. That's part of one. And two, even as a science, it's not like we have the laws of physics that we can kind of apply here. I wish we could. The laws of branding and marketing are not laws. There are just more, that's why the philosophy comes in. It's the art of that. So to me, the success or failure depends on how strategically and creatively marketing programs and activities are designed and crafted and then executed and implemented, and strategically and creatively. And that's the art and science to me, as I've tried to describe it in this talk. So my advice to you, and this is my last comment, we'll open up the questions, is develop a really rich, expansive toolkit. I really find tools and concepts and frameworks that help break down problems can be so helpful in marketing and branding. And as I said, I've got some in our textbooks, but also there's certainly others out there. And then be guided by a well-reasoned, imaginative philosophy. And that's partly, think about what you truly believe in and make sure you understand how that guides how you think of consumers, competition, companies, all the different kinds of aspects. So I tried to give you a feel for some of the lessons that I took away. And I know you've been learning all your lessons through your experience and through what you've learned and read and seen and talked about, et cetera. But to me, that's the key, is making sure you know how to use the tools because you're being guided by philosophy. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone for sticking around. It's a great turnout on a Friday evening in Mumbai. Wish everyone good luck. But now we can open it up for Q&A, which is great. So let me stop sharing. I hope that was helpful. I've got some hands raised. And so let me see. Somebody want to help with the Kavita? Do you want to help with the quiet Q&A? Do you want to just call on people for me?
I will do that.
That'd be great. And then,
thank you so much for such an engaging talk that you have given, and the brands that you have used and the philosophy. I'm sure there are many questions and many hands up for the questions. So before we go to questions, may I request Indrapal ji, who is our past president, to give his comments.
Yeah, Professor Keller, that's been a wonderful presentation. And I particularly liked that even at your level of expertise, you have taken time off to cull out the lessons learned from your various consulting assignments and given us a bouquet of the learnings. I wonder whether in real life situations, operating managers, whether they do the similar exercise. And therefore, perhaps there is not much learning on which one can build upon. So I thought that was a wonderful idea. The second one was about the brand philosophy. I felt that word philosophy itself in today's fast-moving digital times appears to be a bit dated, in the sense that who has time to talk about philosophy? And when there is all kind of social media and other pressures are there to get things out and communicate things, do operating people have time to dwell into philosophy of branding? And the third observation is that virtually all success elements that you describe has some sort of a paradox built into this. The do traditional and the new distribution. Stay grounded but be creative, etc. Typically, young people get involved in branding, and the tendencies are that they would go probably either one way. Either we tend to stay grounded, or we move ahead, ignoring the past or the core values. So these are some of my views. Your comments, please.
No, those are, I think those are great observations. And I think one of the things, I'll just pick up especially on that second point about how, and it kind of related a little bit to the third even, but in a fast moving world, the time to think. And one of the things at the Tuck School where I teach, and our dean especially is a big proponent, is finding time for reflection. And I really think that's important, and I totally agree. So one of the things I find, and I'm sure this is true in India and in Mumbai with the business schools, is one of the advantages you have when you do workshops with executives or executive education. They come and listen to you talk, and you give them hopefully some ideas, but they actually get time to think. And I think they often come away inspired, invigorated, energized, because they don't get a chance to do that much. Now, you don't have to go to an exec ed or to a university or a seminar or a lecture to do that. You can do that yourself. Just set aside the time. And I think that the 1 hour that it takes to sort of think through a little bit more, thoughtfully and carefully about your brand and where it is and what it's doing and what you've learned and what you need to learn, just taking stock is so critical. So I love your comments and I love the observation, but I'm going to take that and then ask people to build that in, because the time, and the last thing I'll say, the one challenge one thing we have to be careful about in today's marketing world, and we faced this 20 years ago. 20 years ago, there was the scanner revolution in many countries around the world, where there was all this data from the UPC code scanners. And we learned all this about now we knew customers, and if I did a coupon, what would happen. And so people became very reactive and very behaviorally driven. And I think some brands got in real trouble in different ways because they were too data driven. They lost a little bit of the humanity. They lost a lot of things that are part of that equation. That can be helpful. It's not the whole story. Same thing happening now. So I can learn all the things about social media and followers and all these different things, but you've got to be careful not to, again, too reactive, too behavioral, thinking and making sure that you're being strategic, that you're understanding people in the full range of your customers in a comprehensive way too, the head and the heart and just all of that. So anyway, great comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll request Professor Fernandez to give his comments.
Thank you, Professor Kevin. The comment I'd like to make is that as practical marketeers, we are put in a situation where we have got to go up against all these big brands. And how do we launch a successful brand against these brands? And therefore, one of the suggestions which I found useful was to find the fact that these brands are not perfect. They have some gap. And the way to launch a new brand is perhaps to exploit that gap. What do you think of this type of thinking?
Yeah, no, I think that's so critical. And I think if big brands, often one of the challenges they have, they often can be older. The fact that they're bigger, they may seem less in touch or less personal. Just by the way they're set up. So those are two vulnerabilities, excuse me, that almost always can be exploited. But absolutely, it's always trying to take, in some ways, the advantages or strengths of your competitors and neutralize them because of the disadvantages that may go with that. So that I agree with that that's why I've always liked the term challenger brands. If I'm a small brand, I'm a challenger brand. I'm challenging them, and I'm finding ways to challenge them based on exploiting perceived weaknesses that they have, because all brands have to overcome those. And that's why my model of positioning talks about points of difference and points of parity, because even a strong brand has weaknesses they have to try to get parity on. My job as a challenger brand is to exploit those weaknesses so that consumers choose me and start to choose me. And again, the advantage of a strong challenger brand is if you truly provide an alternative to a market leader, people start writing about you and talking about you. Okay, but you have to get enough credibility and legitimacy for that to happen. So you got to find the right way to exploit those vulnerabilities or weaknesses. So, but I couldn't agree more. So great comment.
Thank you. I'll request Aditya to unmute himself and ask question.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening and good morning, Professor. Really excited, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. My question is specifically for the Samsung case that you explained, and really good insights there. But when I see the technology sector, especially the smartphone sector, there's always this trade-off that brands have to make, especially Samsung versus Apple, between when they're creating a brand equity, between, as a symbol of self-expression in case of Apple, let's say, versus performance in case of a brand like Samsung or Oppo or a Xiaomi, right? So what is your view on what do consumers value higher? Is it emotional value or is it functional value?
Yeah, no, look, a great question. And again, it's one of those, and I hate to say this, but sort of both. I really feel like head and the heart that people are rational and they're emotional. And the more you can connect those, And it's interesting, to your point, I agree. I think Apple's challenge was to make sure that people appreciated, they told a great story, an emotional one, but people needed to know they could actually use the brand, which, again, it's a long story, but I think iPod and iTunes was critical for their growth in terms of opening doors to them. But then the rational, then all the great design that they did and everything came into play. Samsung's a little bit the opposite, to your point. It's, you know, more performance anchored. They need to bring in a little bit more of the emotional. And they've done a great job in the US, by the way. And part of it is some very good advertising. And so made the brand seem very contemporary, fresh, like a real challenger to Apple, because Apple's advertising is so strong. And so they've been really able to kind of connect on that level in a way to allow them to compete. So that would be again, I kind of come back to, they're both really important, but the key is you've got to figure out what is it that is going to allow you to connect in the head and the heart and to link the two when you're going to consumers. And that's to me the magic of really good marketers, or how well they're able to, with their products and the experiences they create, that they're able to do both, and the communications they have.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll request Mohi to unmute himself and ask the question. Mohi, are you there? Jagmohanji, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, ma'am. Great presentation, Professor Keller. And I have one comment and one question. The comment is that when you mentioned about the me time or time for reflection, when Professor Keller says it or Professor Blanchard says it, we listen to it. But in case an Indian yogi instructor says it, we don't listen to it. The question is that, we have been reading all these marketing tactics and strategies and philosophy. But suddenly this COVID has turned everything upside down. No, question becomes is that there are newer companies which have come up and which have adjusted to this new normal, and they have launched their brands, challenges, as you rightly said, challenging the established companies. So my question to you is that, like companies like Levi's or P&G and other companies, how ready they are with respect to these challengers? Because these challengers have a startup mindset. They can change very easily. Whereas the established organizations, they are monoliths, difficult to move and change so easily. So do you think they need to have a challenger, startup mindset also in the process in case they want to be relevant?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think it's a little bit ties into what we're talking about a little bit earlier about having a big, strong brand. How do you challenge it? And the big, strong brands have vulnerabilities. Well, this is one of them, which is their agility, their ability to innovate and stay relevant. That's why I came back to that. And Levi's, by the way, I have to give you the last chapter of that. They hired a CEO named Chip, or the most recent, hopefully not the last chapter, the most recent chapter. They hired a CEO, Chip Berg, who has great P&G experience in Gillette and other places. But and he's done a phenomenal job there. He's with the product, with their communications, their purpose. So the value proposition, he's really, really pulled all that together in a way to make the brand relevant again and innovative again. So I think it kind of comes back to that if the more, so the way I look at it, if you're constantly moving forward in the right direction, and that's key with consumers, then that challenger is always going to have to be playing catch up some. Now, that's not to say they can't create some significant challenges. They can, but at least I'm in a stronger position where I have the momentum, where I'm making the changes already in different ways. I think one of the interesting things is brand architecture. How do you introduce certain brands and ways to satisfy some of the needs of those customers who are attracted to the challenger? But you have to be careful. You can't be something you're not. And that's the one thing I always worry about, is overreacting to a challenger, trying to be something you're not, and then having trouble executing against that. So I'd rather see brands constantly move forward and then finding ways to, when the challenges come up, finding ways to defend some of their market share, if you will, through the right sort of offerings and in different ways. But again, just being careful not to lose sight of who they are. But great question. That's going to be very interesting coming out. And it's even before the pandemic, to the comments made earlier. This trend's been going for a while with some of the new challengers coming on. So
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I'll request Nikita to unmute herself. Nikita? Madam Arpita Pandey, please unmute.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a wonderful session, Mr. Keller. We have been reading your books and referring your quotes in our classes as well. So wonderful listening to you directly. My question is, what kind of a philosophy of branding we should use to promote or position educational institute? Say, for example, a B school. So how should we position them and brand them?
Yeah, great question. And it's certainly something that I'm interested in. And the introduction, my title is Senior Associate Dean of Marketing Communications at Tech School. So I'm involved in branding our school and how to think. I think a lot of the principles apply strategically in terms of trying to find the value proposition and creating value, what makes you unique about what you do, but also points of parity, making sure you break even in different ways. Our school is a relatively small school among the top 10 schools or top 15 schools in the US or around the world for that matter in business schools. So we really we have a mantra, which is personal, connected, transformative. And that guides our thinking about the programs we deliver and create and the experiences we try to establish for our students, how we communicate. So I think a lot of this applies. I'll tell you that one of the biggest challenges is educational institutions don't like to think of themselves as a business. They see it as very mission driven, very purpose driven. So you'll find those outside of the marketing circles who don't like the idea of thinking themselves as a brand and to think of themselves as in terms of being positioned. But the fact of the matter is that is the case. And so business schools at least are a little better than other parts of the university where the English department or some of those departments, history department, where they really have trouble with the concept of thinking in this way. But that's something that, often you need to do a little work internally to make sure people appreciate the strategy that you're also expressing externally.
Thank you. I will request Madam Chaya Sehgal to unmute herself and ask the question.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Keller, for this exhaustive and yet a succinct take on branding with some of the most world-class brands. I noticed the Mayo Clinic logo in one of the earlier slides, and I did a lot of work in creating a case study with them when I was there with them for 15 days. I wanted you now to talk about your experience with Mayo Clinic and the lessons in branding, because it's a not-for-profit organization and yet has successfully stood financially on top in its domain. What is it that has gone about making it so successful despite being like an NGO, what we call in our country, and not focusing on money at all and still being financially on top? So your branding lessons on that, if you could share, we'll be very happy to know.
Oh, no, okay, great question. And it's a little bit follows up from the last question because it's, again, sort of more of a nonprofit, if you will, sort of setting. In the Mayo Clinic, I've worked with them for almost 20 years, helped them establish the Office of Brand Management. I mean, part of it was, like I was just saying about universities, hospitals, medical centers are the same way. They don't always think of themselves and in terms of competing or in any way because they feel very mission driven, which is true. But the reality is you've got to attract patients. one of the challenges with the Mayo Clinic was it was seen as so exclusive that many people didn't think it was relevant to them. So we worked hard about accessibility so that it wasn't too expensive. It wasn't just for famous people, or it wasn't just for people who were really, really sick, okay? So that's one. But the other thing about the Mayo Clinic, they had some very distinguishing characteristics. And I'm sure you learned this in your case study. The teamwork approach they have is phenomenal in how well integrated they are. The humanistic approach they have is phenomenal. The trust that they have is phenomenal. So they had a lot of intrinsics and they had a lot of extrinsics. And to me, the lesson, again, that I take away for any, and I work a lot with nonprofits. I like working with nonprofits because they're doing great things for the world. So NGOs and others, so I on boards and everything. And it is to help people better appreciate the value they're creating in their work and what they're doing uniquely. And whether it's an autism foundation, whether it's the local kind of community theater, whatever it is, you know, the value they create. So I apply all of those principles to them. And Mayo Clinic was a good example. I learned a lot working with them about the intrinsics, the extrinsics, and the importance of telling the story, if you will, because they had a great story. So I'm sure it's a really good case study. So I'm glad you were able to put that together.
Thank you, Professor. Just a little more, explanation if you could give about their ethics and the sustainability because of their social focus.
Yeah,
branding.
Yeah, that's funny. Their logo has the 3 shields, and a lot of people don't even know what that means. But they're an educational. They are more. They do a whole lot of things for the better good, if you will, beyond just clinical care, which they provide. But I think that they are seen as the trusted authority. So that's the ethics piece, I would say, is that you truly can, that people go there for answers, where they really need answers and they want the right answers and they want to know them in the right way. And that's what you get from the Mayo Clinic. And that's the thing I think that is a wonderful position. It kind of goes back to credibility. We talked about it earlier, expertise, trustworthiness, likability. And that's what the Mayo Clinic tries to do, all 3. Just phenomenal healthcare that you can trust with your interest, the patient interest in mind. And then they try to make the atmosphere and everything as positive, knowing that it is a stressful time when you go to the hospital. So I just had knee surgery, by the way, last week. I had my meniscus repaired. So it was a ping pong injury. It's not very dramatic, I'm sorry, but I heard it playing ping pong. But anyway, so I was just in our local hospital. And again, it was an in and out operation, but you always want that. And they did a great job. You want that seamless sort of care. So, and that's what they did. So anyway, thanks for the question.
Very soon, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah, no.
Thank you. This is last question. I think Varun Rumta, I'll request you to unmute yourself and ask the question.
First of all, thank you for your time, Professor Keller. Your session was really useful for someone starting a new brand in India. Just to give you a little background, I'm working on starting a brand in a cannabis-focused health and wellness space, and was wondering if you had any advice for someone starting new in an industry which is heavily regulated, as well as has a certain amount of taboo associated with it with the consumers.
Yeah, it's a great question. And by the way, I'm happy to stay. If people want to stay, I'll do questions for another 10 or 15 minutes. So just so you know, but again, if everyone has to leave or this has to stop, that's fine too. But just so you know. But to your question, I mean, that's 2 things. The regulation is one thing. You just have to operate within that. And even when we were talking about the Mayo Clinic, they have regulations. I mean, everyone has regulations. The trickier one is the industry and how to address some of those challenges. And I think I'd be thinking a lot about segmentation, because there are different segments. Some are going to be more forthcoming and positive than others. And I would be factoring that in. And it really is trying to figure out how to tell, what are the myths that people have about, because I always think that marketing is most effective when there's that gap between perceptions and reality. People just aren't up to date enough. They don't realize certain things. So if you can find ways, make sure you identify what those are, some of the myths that you need to address in different ways. And it's not as if, you can completely dispel them, but at least to try to inform people in a way so they update and you close that gap some. I think that's one of the really important steps for you to take. And the key is also how to do that. And what's the best, most arguments that make the most sense to people. And I would test those out a little bit. I mean, that's something where I would do it can be very low cost research in different ways to just better understand how to tell your story, because it's going to be so important, I think. So, but good luck with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are so many questions in chat box, but because of time, we'll not be able to take them. But I'll request Professor Isaac Jacob to give his last word so that we can stop there. Yeah.
As always, I think Professor Keller, listening to you, is revitalizing and restaging our academic thinking process, especially on brand management. And it's indeed very wonderful to see you again and to listen to you and giving us those nuggets of, real truths as far as understanding branding and branding process is concerned. As I mentioned, it's always restaging oneself, towards the end when you come to revitalizing your own thinking as such. Really wonderful. And thank you very much. Very succinct. And as we all have said, that very succinct, very brief, but very, very intense way of understanding the branding process. And of course, the long-term, process that we need to build up as far as branding is concerned. And of course, the most important factor is the prerogative of having a very strong framework in order to create a strong brand with a long term, for instance. Branding is a long-term concept. Thank you very much. It's always very great to listen to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Keller, it was very nice to spend this 1.5 hours with you, with all my colleagues from BMA, from academia, and many student friends who are here to listen to you. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and to talk to the participants on the important learnings that you had by working on these brands. I'm sure all of us will definitely think about the learnings and the lessons that you have spoken and work on that. Your answer on academic branding was very, very apt, and many of us who are from academics can think of similar kind of exercise for us. There are many questions which are unanswered. In this chat box, there are at least 10 to 15 questions. I will share them with you, and you can have the type of questions that the audience wanted. Many of them you have answered, but then thank you so much for being with us. I'll acknowledge presence of the past presidents who were here. Professor Konda, Nitin Bhagwat is really very much here. Chaya Madam, we have Indrapal ji, we have Fernandez sir, my colleagues on executive committee, Rajesh ji, Kiran Yadav, Bigyan ji, Indranil, Jagmohan Rishi, Panikkar, and from academia, many of my colleagues from different institutions, including Dr. R. Srinivasan from JB, Monica Khanna, Shubhrashi Sarkar, Ajit Navre, Moradian sir, Kajetan D'Souza, Akhtarwala, Isaac, and many more. Thank you for being with us. It was very nice to listen to you, and have a nice day. Thank you. Good night to all the people who are in India, and Professor Keller, you have a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's great to see everyone. Thanks so much for spending the time.
Thank you very much.
Good luck. Stay healthy. Have a great weekend.
Yes.